They called it the Hanging Territory, a stretch of East Texas wilderness where oak trees became gallows and professional manhunters learned the meaning of terror. Between 1851 and 1853, 48 slave catchers entered those pine forests and river bottoms pursuing human property. None of them walked out alive. Their bodies were discovered suspended from branches, boots removed and placed beneath them in neat rows, tracking papers shredded and scattered like autumn leaves. Each corpse bore the same signature: hands bound with their own rope, position facing east toward the rising sun, left hanging long enough that birds and weather made identification difficult. The county sheriffs who cut them down noted something that kept them awake at night. The bodies showed no signs of struggle at the moment of death. These men had died from exhaustion and exposure days before being hanged. They'd been kept alive long enough to understand what was coming. Tonight we're examining evidence that suggests one man orchestrated what became the deadliest campaign of resistance against slave catchers in Texas history. A man who transformed grief into methodology, who studied his enemies with the patience of a scientist, who turned the pine forests of East Texas into a hunting ground where the hunters became the hunted. This isn't a story about spontaneous violence or desperate escape. This is about calculation, about a mind that understood exactly how to break the system designed to break him. Before we descend into the story of Malachi Briggs, understand something. What you're about to hear challenges everything comfortable narratives tell us about resistance, about justice, about what human beings become when pushed beyond the boundaries of endurance. These aren't sanitized heroes or simple villains. These are people confronting impossible circumstances with choices that still disturb us a century and a half later. The man who would become Texas's most wanted fugitive wasn't born into violence. He was a blacksmith. His hands built things, forged iron into tools, shaped metal into horseshoes and wagon parts, created objects that helped people survive the brutal work of frontier life. Those same hands would later tie 48 knots with a precision that suggested ritual. Malachi Briggs appeared in the records of the Henderson estate near Nacogdoches in 1838, purchased at age 19 from a bankrupt plantation in Louisiana. The bill of sale described him simply: healthy male, skilled in blacksmithing and metalwork, literate, value $1,200. That literacy was unusual enough to be noted, dangerous enough to concern some buyers, but valuable enough to justify the premium price. A blacksmith who could read technical manuals, who could follow written specifications, who could adapt designs from books and journals, that was an asset worth the risk. The Henderson estate sprawled across 8,000 acres of rich bottomland where the Angelina River carved its way through East Texas. Cotton was a crop, as it was everywhere in the South during those years, but the estate also operated a substantial blacksmith operation serving neighboring plantations and the growing town of Nacogdoches. Malachi ran that operation with an efficiency that plantation records noted repeatedly. Output increased, quality improved, repairs were completed faster. The Henderson family congratulated themselves on a wise investment. They had no idea they were training someone who would use every skill they taught him to destroy men exactly like them. Texas in the 1840s and early 1850s existed in a strange space between frontier and established slave state. It had entered the Union in 1845, carrying all the contradictions of Southern plantation culture into a landscape that wasn't quite ready for it. The Mexican government had abolished slavery in 1829, but Anglo settlers in Texas had ignored that law, had fought partially to preserve their right to own human beings, and had constructed in the new Republic of Texas a constitution that protected slavery as explicitly as any Deep South state. By the time Texas joined the United States, its enslaved population had grown to over 30,000 people. The ratio wasn't as extreme as in Alabama or Mississippi, but the system was just as brutal, just as dependent on violence and terror to maintain control. And that system required slave catchers, professional trackers who made their living pursuing fugitives through hundreds of miles of wilderness, men who knew how to read trails, how to think like someone running for their life, how to predict where desperate people would go when they had nowhere to go. These weren't casual amateurs. They were specialists, often former frontiersmen or Indian fighters, who developed tracking skills in other contexts and found that hunting human beings paid better than hunting animals. They worked on contract, charging by the day, plus a substantial bonus for successful capture. A skilled tracker could earn more in a month than most farmers made in a year. The work was dangerous, required weeks away from home, involved confrontations with armed and desperate people, but the money was too good to resist. Malachi spent 13 years at the Henderson estate learning his craft, perfecting his work, and watching. He watched how the overseers moved, how they thought, what patterns governed their behavior. He watched the slave catchers when they passed through, stopping at the estate to rest their horses and brag about their latest captures. He listened to their stories, their techniques, the methods they used to track and corner and capture. He absorbed it all with the methodical attention he brought to his blacksmithing, filing away information he didn't yet know he'd need. In 1847, he married a woman named Rebecca who worked in the Henderson house. She was 23, quick-witted, capable of navigating the impossible social dynamics that enslaved people had to master to survive. They had 2 years together. 2 years of stolen moments and whispered conversations and the particular kind of hope that enslaved people learned to carry. The hope that maybe if they were valuable enough, useful enough, obedient enough, they might be allowed to build something that resembled a life. That hope died on a Thursday morning in October 1849. Thomas Henderson, the plantation owner's youngest son, had accumulated gambling debts in New Orleans that threatened the family's reputation. The solution was straightforward. Sell off enough property to cover the debt and restore the family name. Rebecca was included in that sale. Not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she was less valuable, but because the mathematics of debt required it. Malachi's desperate offer to be sold alongside her was refused. His blacksmithing skills were too valuable to lose. Rebecca's household work could be replaced easily. The transaction was completed in a single afternoon. She was gone by evening, transported to a plantation near Houston, 200 miles away through country that might as well have been another continent. Malachi requested permission to visit. Denied. He requested permission to send letters. Denied. He requested information about whether she was well, whether she was being treated fairly, whether she was alive. No response. For 7 months he worked his forge with mechanical precision while something fundamental calcified inside him. Not rage exactly, though rage was part of it. Something colder, more patient, more methodical. He began making small items that the Henderson family never ordered. Locks that could be picked from the inside. Blades that could be concealed in boots or waistbands. Lengths of chain that could restrain or strangle. He hid these items carefully, building an inventory against a need he was beginning to accept as inevitable. In May 1850, a tracker passed through the Henderson estate returning a captured fugitive to a plantation near Marshall. The man was young, maybe 25, known locally for his success rate and his willingness to use dogs when trails went cold. He stayed for dinner, entertaining the Henderson family with stories about his most difficult pursuits, about the clever tricks fugitives tried, about how he always got his man eventually. Malachi served that dinner, standing silent along the wall as house servants did, and listened to the tracker describe a recent case. Woman who'd run from a plantation near Houston, made it almost to Louisiana before he caught her. Put up a fight, had to restrain her pretty firmly. Delivered her back in rough shape, but the owner didn't seem to mind much. Lost value, but at least she'd serve as an example. The tracker never mentioned the woman's name. Didn't need to. Malachi knew. He knew the timeline, knew the location, knew the description matched. He knew that Rebecca had run, had nearly made it to freedom, had been caught and brutalized and returned to a plantation that would punish a failure in ways designed to break anyone else's will to try again. He knew that the laughing man eating at the Henderson table had been the one to destroy whatever chance she'd had. That night, Malachi finished his evening work with his usual care. He banked the forge properly, organized his tools, cleaned the work area. Then he walked to the small cabin he'd shared with Rebecca for those 2 brief years. He gathered the items he'd been making in hiding. He took 2 knives, 20 feet of chain, a set of lockpicks, and a small leather pouch containing the herbs he'd learned could treat wounds or induce sleep or cause paralysis in the right doses. Then he walked away from the Henderson estate into the pine forests of East Texas, carrying the name of the tracker who'd caught Rebecca and a crystal clear understanding of what he was about to become. The first body was discovered 4 days later hanging from a post oak 20 miles northeast of Nacogdoches. The tracker who'd dined at the Henderson estate, the one who'd laughed about catching a woman from Houston, was suspended 6 feet off the ground, his boots placed neatly below him, his face already being worked over by crows. The county sheriff, a man named Garrett Worth, cut him down and documented what he found. Victim showed signs of extensive flight through difficult terrain, lacerations consistent with fast march through bramble and thorn, severe dehydration despite proximity to creek water. Time of death estimated at 3 to 4 days before discovery, but hanging occurred post-mortem. Cause of death appears to be cardiac failure from exhaustion. Worth noted something else in his private journal, something he didn't include in the official report. The rope work was exceptional, the kind of knots you'd see from someone who understood mechanics and leverage, who knew exactly how weight and tension and friction worked together. And the body's positioning was too deliberate to be accidental. Facing east, hands bound identically, everything about the scene suggested planning and purpose. Worth had seen battlefield dead, had investigated murders and accidents and suicides. This was something different. This was a message, though he couldn't yet read what it said. The Henderson estate reported Malachi missing 3 days after the body was found. The connection wasn't made immediately. A missing slave and a dead tracker seemed like separate incidents, unfortunate coincidences in a dangerous time. The reward posted for Malachi's return was standard, $100, describing him as potentially dangerous due to blacksmithing skills and literacy. 3 weeks later, 2 more bodies appeared in the forests west of San Augustine. Another pair of trackers, both with established reputations, both found hanging from pine trees in identical positions, both showing the same pattern of death from exhaustion followed by post-mortem suspension. This time someone noticed the tracking papers. Every document these men had carried, every legal authorization to pursue and capture fugitives, had been torn into strips and woven into the grass beneath their bodies like obscene nests. Sheriff Worth, riding out to investigate, found himself looking at a signature. Not a written name, but something just as clear. The way the ropes were tied, the positioning of the bodies, the destruction of the tracking papers, all of it spoke a language he was beginning to understand. Someone was waging war against slave catchers specifically, systematically, with a level of skill that suggested professional knowledge. Worth was a pragmatic man who'd lived in Texas long enough to understand its contradictions. He'd fought in the Revolution, had helped establish law in territories that had never known it, had made compromises with systems he found morally troubling because maintaining order seemed more important than confronting injustice. But he recognized what he was seeing. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic revenge. This was methodology, someone who'd studied their enemies and learned exactly how to break them. In a letter to a fellow lawman in Shreveport, Worth wrote something he never put in official reports. We are confronting intelligence and determination that challenges every assumption we make about the people we keep in bondage. Whoever is responsible has turned the entire mechanism of tracking and capture into theater, demonstrating that the hunters are just as vulnerable as the hunted, that confidence in safety is an illusion, that the system we depend upon can be made to collapse through focused pressure on its most essential workers. By August 1850, 4 months after Malachi Briggs walked away from the Henderson estate, 7 slave catchers had been found hanging in the forests of East Texas. The pattern was undeniable now. All were experienced professionals with established reputations. All had been active in the Houston to Nacogdoches corridor. All died from exhaustion before being hanged, suggesting they'd been pursued to the point of collapse, kept alive just long enough to understand what was coming, then killed and displayed as warnings. The tracking profession in East Texas entered a state of crisis. Contracts went unfilled. Reward amounts doubled, then tripled, but still found few takers. Men who'd built careers on the certainty that they were the predators, never the prey, suddenly had to confront the possibility that entering certain forests meant accepting real danger to their own lives. And somewhere in those pine forests and river bottoms, Malachi Briggs was refining his method, learning from each encounter, becoming more efficient at the thing he'd taught himself to do. He wasn't running from slave catchers. He was hunting them. The Henderson family increased Malachi's reward to $300 by September 1850. They described him as extremely dangerous, skilled in weapon making, and possibly responsible for the tracker deaths. But the language in their wanted posters revealed something they hadn't intended to admit. They were afraid, not just of losing property or facing financial loss, but genuinely afraid that someone they'd owned, Someone who'd eaten their food scraps and slept in their quarters and built their tools, had become something they couldn't control or predict or stop. Other plantation owners throughout East Texas began recognizing a pattern that terrified them more than the body count. Malachi Briggs wasn't just killing trackers. He was selecting them. Not every manhunter who entered his territory disappeared. Some returned safely, their targets captured or lost, seemingly untouched by the threat that had claimed so many others. The survivors shared certain characteristics. They were younger, less experienced, or had reputations for relatively straightforward work, capturing fugitives without excessive brutality, returning them without using the journey as an opportunity for additional punishment. The men who died were different. They were the notorious ones. Trackers known for using dogs trained to tear flesh, for separating captured mothers from children as punishment for running, for inflicting beatings during the return journey that sometimes killed their captives before delivery. These were men whose names made enslaved people go silent when mentioned, whose reputations for cruelty exceeded even what the brutal system required. Malachi Briggs was somehow researching his targets, investigating their histories, making judgments about who deserved to face what he'd planned for them. A physician named Dr. Solomon Yates, who examined several of the bodies, wrote a confidential report to local authorities that was never officially filed but survived in his private papers. The deceased show evidence of systematic exhaustion over multiple days, he wrote. Dehydration despite access to water sources, malnutrition despite being in forest with abundant game, injuries consistent with deliberate herding through difficult terrain. Most significantly, several bodies showed traces of plant compounds in tissue samples, substances that would cause severe gastrointestinal distress without causing immediate death. Whoever is responsible possesses medical or veterinary knowledge, understands human physiology, and is using that knowledge to inflict maximum psychological trauma before death occurs. Dr. Yates had studied at medical school in Philadelphia before moving to Texas, had read the latest research on toxicology and physiology, had examined hundreds of bodies in his career. What disturbed him wasn't just the deaths themselves, but the sophistication they represented. This wasn't crude violence. This was applied knowledge. Someone using scientific understanding to transform murder into lesson, to make death educational for the victims and terrifying for anyone who heard about it. The case that revealed exactly how Malachi operated came in October 1850 through the testimony of a survivor. His name was William Deacon, and he'd been tracking fugitives for 8 years when he accepted a contract to pursue a family of 5 who'd escaped from a plantation near Crockett. The trail led him deep into the Big Thicket, that vast expanse of nearly impenetrable forest where pine and hardwood and cypress swamp mixed into a landscape that could hide anything or anyone indefinitely. Deacon was experienced enough to be cautious, smart enough to recognize danger, but confident enough to believe his skills would see him through. He was wrong about that last part. On his 6th day of pursuit, Deacon woke before dawn to discover his horse was gone. Not broken loose, not scared off, just gone. The rope he'd used to tie it had been cut cleanly, professionally, and the horse had been led away quietly enough that Deacon, sleeping light the way experienced trackers learned to do, hadn't heard a thing. His supplies remained untouched. His weapons were still within reach. But his mobility, his ability to cover ground quickly or escape if necessary, had been removed with surgical precision. Deacon spent 2 hours searching for the horse, following tracks that led him in a wide circle back to his camp. He was being shown something. That his security was an illusion, that someone had been close enough to cut rope and lead away an animal while he slept, that everything he believed about his own capability was being questioned. He made the intelligent decision to abandon the pursuit and head back toward Crockett on foot. That's when he discovered that intelligent decisions didn't matter anymore. The landmarks he'd noted on his way and had been subtly altered. Blazes cut into trees to mark his path had been changed, not removed entirely, but modified just enough to send him in wrong directions. Creek crossings he remembered were suddenly unfathomable, dammed overnight with branches and stones to force him to find new routes. Water sources he'd planned to use turned out to be fouled with rotting vegetation, drinkable only after lengthy boiling that consumed time he didn't have. For 3 days, Deacon tried to navigate back to civilization while someone invisible and patient made that journey as difficult as possible. His food disappeared from his pack, taken while he slept or looked away, never all at once, just enough each day to create mounting anxiety about starvation. His ammunition was scattered one morning while he bathed in a creek, bullets hidden in brush where he spent hours recovering only half of what he'd carried. His knife vanished from its sheath while he slept, appearing the next morning driven deep into a tree trunk 15 feet from where he'd camped, a demonstration of how close someone had been, how vulnerable he'd become. On the fourth morning, Deacon woke to find a man sitting across the remains of his campfire. The stranger was tall, powerfully built, with hands that showed scars from a lifetime of physical work. He sat with absolute stillness, studying Deacon the way someone might study a specimen under glass, with curiosity but no particular hostility or fear. Most troubling to Deacon was what the man held. Not a weapon, but Deacon's own journal, the detailed notebook where trackers recorded pursuit information, tactics that worked, descriptions of fugitives, notes about payments received. "You're William Deacon," the man said, and it wasn't a question. "You've been tracking for 8 years. You caught the Morrison brothers in 1847. You returned the Coleman woman and her children in 1848. You're known for being persistent, but not unnecessarily brutal. That reputation just saved your life." Deacon, paralyzed by the sudden confirmation of who this had to be, managed to nod. "The family you're tracking crossed into Louisiana 3 days ago," Malachi Briggs continued, his voice calm and measured, like he was discussing crop prices or weather patterns. "I watched you follow their trail, watched you make good decisions, professional decisions. You're competent at what you do, which makes this conversation necessary." He closed the journal and set it down carefully, but not close enough for Deacon to grab quickly. "You have a choice now," Malachi said. "You can go back to Crockett. Tell your employer the trail went cold, collect whatever partial payment protects your reputation, and find other work. Or you can continue in this profession, taking contracts in East Texas, pursuing people through forests I know better than you ever will. If you make that second choice, understand what it means. I know your name now. I know your methods, your habits, your level of skill. And if I ever see you tracking anyone in my territory again, you'll join the others. Not as punishment exactly, but as education. You'll learn what it feels like to be pursued without mercy, to realize that every advantage you thought you had was an illusion, that the landscape itself has become hostile." Deacon found his voice enough to ask the question that had been consuming him. "What happened to Rebecca?" Something flickered across Malachi's face, grief or rage compressed into a single expression that lasted half a second before the controlled calm returned. "She died," he said simply. 3 weeks after they caught her running toward Louisiana. They made an example of her, made sure everyone on that plantation understood what happens when you try to escape. They worked her in the fields despite fever, withheld water despite heat, prevented anyone from helping her. She died knowing she'd almost made it, knowing she'd come within miles of freedom before someone like you dragged her back to hell. The silence stretched long enough that Deacon could hear individual birds beginning their morning songs, could hear wind moving through pine branches, could hear his own heart hammering in his chest. "I'm not asking you to understand," Malachi continued. "I'm not seeking your sympathy or your moral approval. I'm educating you about reality. The reality that every person you've ever caught and dragged back to bondage has felt what you've felt these past few days. That fear, that exhaustion, that understanding that you're completely powerless against forces you can't fight or escape. You've spent 8 years inflicting that on people. Now you know what it tastes like." He stood up then, smooth and unhurried, and began walking toward the tree line. "Your weapons are half a mile north, unloaded but intact," he said without turning back. "Your horse is tied 2 miles east with enough feed for 3 days. Your supplies are cached along the creek where you first camped. You can recover everything and make it back to Crockett safely if you start now. But if I ever hear your name connected to tracking work in East Texas again, you'll die the same way the others died. Learning what you spent years teaching. Understanding what you inflicted. Realizing too late that actions have consequences and that victims sometimes refuse to remain victims." Then he disappeared into the forest, moving through underbrush with barely a sound, leaving Deacon alone with his extinguished fire and his racing thoughts and his fundamental reassessment of what he did for a living. William Deacon returned to Crockett 5 days later. He reported that the trail had gone cold and refused payment. He never worked as a tracker again, eventually moving to Arkansas where he became a farmer and spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss his time hunting fugitives. But before he left Texas, he shared his story with Sheriff Garrett Worth, who recorded it in detailed notes that survived in county archives. That account, combined with similar testimonies from two other trackers who survived encounters with Malachi Briggs, revealed the methodology behind the killings. Malachi wasn't simply ambushing and murdering slave catchers. He was selecting targets based on their reputations, researching their backgrounds with thoroughness that suggested extensive intelligence gathering, and then subjecting them to precisely calibrated experiences designed to teach them what their victims had felt. The trackers who survived were the ones Malachi judged as potentially redeemable, professionals doing brutal work but not enthusiastically embracing its worst aspects. The ones who died were different. They were men who took pleasure in their work, who inflicted additional cruelty beyond what capture required, who'd built reputations for particular brutality. And the deaths themselves weren't quick or crude. Malachi would pursue his targets for days, systematically exhausting them, demonstrating that every skill they possessed was useless against someone who knew the territory better, who could predict their movements, who controlled access to food and water and rest. He'd let them understand exactly what was happening, let them feel the mounting helplessness, let them experience the psychological collapse that comes from realizing you're completely at someone else's mercy. Only after they'd been reduced to that state, only after they'd learned what their captives had always known, would he end their lives and arrange their bodies as warnings to others. The psychological impact on the tracking profession was devastating. By November 1850, contracts in East Texas offered double the normal rates and still found few takers. Trackers from Louisiana and Arkansas who'd previously worked across state lines began refusing any job that might take them into Malachi's territory. Insurance companies that covered tracking expeditions started excluding East Texas entirely from their policies, stating that the risk had become unquantifiable. Several plantation owners, who'd relied on swift recapture of fugitives, found themselves facing a new reality. Anyone who escaped into the Big Thicket or the pine forests of the Angelina River corridor was effectively unrecoverable, because the professionals who might catch them were too afraid to try. The economic impact was significant enough that a group of wealthy planters met in Nacogdoches in December 1850 to organize a response. They called it the East Texas Recovery Association, though everyone understood its actual purpose. 25 men, all experienced frontiersmen or former military, equipped with the best weapons and supplies money could buy, specifically tasked with ending Malachi Briggs's campaign through overwhelming force and professional coordination. Their leader was a man named Colonel Isaac Drummond, a veteran of the Texas Revolution who'd spent years fighting Comanche raiders on the frontier. He was methodical, experienced, and realistic about what they faced. "We're not hunting an ordinary fugitive," he told his men before they entered the forests. "We're hunting someone who's turned tracking into warfare, who understands tactics and strategy, who's demonstrated patience and intelligence that most of us frankly didn't believe possible from someone in his position. Don't underestimate him. Don't assume your experience or your weapons or your numbers give you automatic advantage. He's survived 6 months while being actively hunted by dozens of professionals. That doesn't happen by accident." The East Texas Recovery Association entered the Big Thicket on December 15, 1850, with confidence tempered by caution and a determination to end the threat decisively. They were expected to return within 3 weeks. When January arrived with no word from them, a second group was organized to investigate. What that group discovered would fundamentally alter how authorities understood what they were confronting. The 25 men hadn't been killed. Not directly. They'd been systematically broken apart as a cohesive unit, isolated into smaller groups, and driven to states of complete psychological collapse without a single shot being fired. 18 of them were found alive, scattered across a 50-mile radius, wandering or huddled in makeshift shelters, all displaying signs of severe trauma and exposure. 4 were discovered dead from apparent natural causes, heart failure and exhaustion and hypothermia. 3 were never found at all. The survivors told remarkably consistent stories despite having been separated and unable to coordinate their accounts. They described their camps being infiltrated at night, supplies moved or hidden, weapons relocated just out of easy reach, nothing stolen outright, but everything subtly disturbed to create an atmosphere of violation and helplessness. They spoke of traps that weren't designed to injure but to delay and frustrate, pitfalls covered with branches that dropped men into muddy holes, trip lines that triggered noisemakers but no actual harm, false trails that led to dead ends or circles back to where they'd started. They described being watched constantly, but almost never seeing their watcher. Occasional glimpses of movement in distant trees, the sense of being observed from elevated positions, fresh footprints appearing on trails they'd walked hours before. They spoke of finding their own tracking marks altered, blazes changed to lead them astray, carefully placed stones kicked aside, navigation becoming impossible despite compasses and experience. Most disturbing were the messages. Notes left in their camps written in educated script on paper torn from their own supplies, containing detailed information about each member of the association, their names and hometowns and families, specific cases they'd been involved in if they were former trackers. One note, discovered by Colonel Drummond himself, contained a single paragraph that he later quoted in his report. "You entered these forests believing your numbers and weapons made you powerful. But power is understanding, and I understand you completely while you understand nothing. I know your names, your homes, your families. I know which of you have tracked human beings for profit and which have simply been hired for this expedition. I know your fears, your weaknesses, your breaking points. And I'm teaching you what every enslaved person knows from birth. That the powerful are only powerful until someone more powerful decides otherwise." By the third week, the association had fractured completely. Arguments erupted over strategy and blame. Two men nearly killed each other over accusations of cowardice. The group splintered into smaller units that couldn't coordinate or support each other effectively. And through it all, Malachi Briggs maintained pressure without ever engaging directly, creating a siege without walls, a battle without combat, a defeat without victory. Colonel Drummond, found by searchers in a state of nicolaps, wrote in his final report something that ended his military reputation, but saved his honesty. "We were defeated not by violence but by knowledge. He knows this territory in ways we cannot match. He understands psychology in ways we didn't anticipate. He's transformed the entire landscape into a weapon, turning every tree and creek and game trail into part of a system designed to exhaust and terrify. I cannot recommend further organized pursuit. This isn't a problem that can be solved through conventional force." The East Texas Recovery Association was quietly dissolved in February 1851. No public explanation was offered. And in the spring of that year, Malachi Briggs's campaign entered its deadliest phase, one that would push the body count toward its final horrifying total and force Texas authorities to confront questions they'd spent decades avoiding. Between March and August 1851, the body count accelerated in ways that suggested either desperation or the approaching completion of some predetermined goal. 19 more slave catchers disappeared in the forests and river bottoms of East Texas during those 6 months. Unlike the earlier pattern, where weeks might pass between incidents, these deaths occurred in rapid succession, sometimes multiple trackers vanishing within days of each other. The positioning of bodies became even more ritualized, arranged in patterns that seemed to carry symbolic meaning though no one could quite interpret the message being sent. The acceleration created something close to panic throughout the tracking profession across the entire South. Word spread through informal networks connecting manhunters from Virginia to Louisiana. East Texas had become untouchable territory, a place where taking contracts meant accepting not just risk but near certain death. Rewards quadrupled to amounts that would make a man wealthy, yet still found almost no takers. The few trackers desperate or foolish enough to accept the money entered the forests with a grim awareness that they probably wouldn't return, that their families would receive payment but no body, that they'd become another warning in a campaign that seemed to have no end. One incident particularly demonstrated how thoroughly Malachi had shifted the psychology of tracking from confidence to terror. A company from Georgia, 6 men with a combined 40 years of experience, accepted an enormous contract to finally end the threat. They were professionals who tracked fugitives through swamps and mountains and wilderness that had defeated lesser hunters. They entered Texas in April 1851 with detailed plans, sophisticated equipment, and strategies developed specifically to counter everything known about Malachi Briggs's methods. They were found 3 weeks later, alive but fundamentally altered in ways that survivors of the East Texas Recovery Association would have recognized. Local residents near Marshall who encountered them emerging from the forests reported men who moved with the careful uncertainty of people who'd been broken on some fundamental level. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, speaking in fragmented sentences when they spoke at all, flinching at unexpected sounds, unable to sleep without someone maintaining watch. Only their leader, a man named Thomas Whitfield, eventually provided any coherent account of what had occurred. He agreed to speak with a Presbyterian minister only after being assured his testimony wouldn't be published during his lifetime. That account, recorded in Reverend Marcus Stone's private journals and discovered in church archives in 1923, described a methodical process of psychological dismantling that revealed the sophistication of Malachi's approach. According to Whitfield, they'd been isolated gradually over 12 days through tactics that demonstrated intimate knowledge of how tracking teams functioned and what sustained their cohesion. Their weapons disappeared while they maintained watch, removed with such skill that men specifically tasked with security somehow missed the theft. They recovered the weapons hours later arranged in a perfect line 50 yards from camp, unloaded, with all ammunition scattered in patterns that took the entire day to collect. Their horses were released and herded miles away, forcing them to continue on foot through increasingly difficult terrain that seemed designed to exhaust rather than kill. Water sources they located turned out to be contaminated with organic matter that caused violent illness if consumed without extensive boiling. Food supplies were stolen incrementally, never all at once, just enough daily to create mounting panic about starvation. Trails they blazed for navigation were altered overnight. Markers moved to create false paths that led them in exhausting circles. They found themselves traveling the same ground repeatedly, recognizing landmarks they'd passed days before, unable to escape a geographic trap that had no walls. But what destroyed Whitfield's company wasn't physical hardship. It was communication. On the seventh day, they discovered a leather-bound journal tucked into one of their saddlebags. Inside were detailed dossiers on each team member, information that could only have been gathered through extensive research. Names, ages, hometowns, family details, years of experience in tracking, specific cases they'd handled, even personal habits and fears expressed in ways that suggested someone had been watching them for weeks before they'd even entered Texas. The journal included case summaries. Whitfield's capture of a 12-year-old boy in Tennessee who'd run after seeing his mother sold. Another member's involvement in breaking up a family group, separating parents from children to fulfill different sale contracts. A third man's reputation for using tracking dogs trained to bite and hold, leaving permanent scars on people he returned. Each case was described in clinical detail, dates and locations and outcomes, followed by a single question written in careful script. Did you consider what you were doing to human beings, or did you only see property to be recovered? It wasn't threatening exactly, Whitfield told Reverend Stone, his hands shaking as he spoke. That's what made it so effective. It was just evidence. Proof that while we'd been hunting others, we'd been completely known. Every aspect of our lives, our work, our choices, all documented by someone we'd dismissed as incapable of that level of thinking. We'd spent years treating enslaved people as things to be tracked and captured, never quite believing they were fully human, fully intelligent. And here was absolute proof that we'd been catastrophically wrong about that. The journal's final page contained a single paragraph that Reverend Stone copied verbatim into his notes. You came to Texas believing you were hunters, believing your experience and your weapons gave you power over me. But I've spent months studying you, learning everything about your lives and your work. I know you better than you know yourselves. And I'm teaching you something that enslaved people understand from childhood. That being known completely by someone who wishes you harm is more terrifying than any physical threat. That the real power isn't in weapons or numbers, but in understanding. You will leave here alive because none of you are the worst of your profession. But you'll leave understanding what you've inflicted on others. Understanding what it means to be hunted. Whitfield's company left Texas within days of emerging from the forests. None of them ever worked as trackers again. Their testimony, shed quietly among tracking networks, effectively ended professional pursuit operations in East Texas. By June 1851, plantation owners in the region faced a reality that challenged the fundamental economics of slavery. Fugitives who escaped into certain territories were simply gone, unrecoverable, because no amount of money could convince professionals to pursue them into forests where Malachi Briggs operated. The situation created political crisis that reached the Texas legislature. Emergency sessions were called to debate responses. Some representatives demanded military intervention, arguing that the state's authority was being fundamentally challenged and that failure to respond would encourage resistance across the South. Others questioned whether resources should be devoted to what was essentially protecting private property, suggesting that plantation owners who couldn't maintain control of their enslaved workers should bear their own losses. A small but vocal minority, mostly from regions of Texas where slavery was less economically central, suggested that violence generating such violent resistance might indicate fundamental problems with the system itself. Governor Peter Bell faced mounting pressure from multiple directions. Wealthy planters demanded action, threatening to withdraw political and financial support if the state couldn't protect their interests. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens questioned why public resources should fund expeditions to recover private property when roads needed building and schools needed funding. Religious communities, particularly Methodists and Quakers concentrated in northern Texas, began publishing sermons and pamphlets questioning whether a system that required hunting human beings might be morally indefensible regardless of its legality. If you're finding this story as compelling and disturbing as we are, this is exactly the kind of hidden history we explore here at the Sealed Room. These are the chapters that textbooks sanitize or erase completely. The stories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about resistance, justice, and what people become under impossible circumstances. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss these deep investigations into America's buried past. And drop a comment telling us what you think so far. Could you survive what these trackers faced? Were Malachi's actions justified given what the system had done to him and Rebecca? We want to hear your perspective. Now let's see how this campaign reached its devastating conclusion. The event that would become the most documented incident of Malachi's campaign occurred in July 1851, and it was orchestrated specifically to draw public attention that authorities could no longer ignore or minimize. A militia captain named Harrison Gould, frustrated by the state's inability to resolve the situation, organized a private expedition of 15 men with the explicit goal of capturing or killing Malachi Briggs and documenting the triumph for public consumption. Unlike previous tracking teams, Gould included 2 journalists, writers from newspapers in Galveston and Austin commissioned to record the expedition and restore public confidence in the system's ability to maintain control. Harrison Gould was a controversial figure. A former Army officer discharged under circumstances never fully explained but involving allegations of excessive force during conflicts with Tejano communities after the Revolution. He'd reinvented himself as a private security contractor specializing in what he called difficult recoveries. His reputation was built on never allowing a target to escape once contracted, regardless of methods required. He tracked down fugitives who'd reached Mexican territory, recovered stolen property through means that local sheriffs found questionable but effective, and built a network of informants and collaborators across East Texas. The expedition was funded by a consortium of 9 plantation owners who'd collectively lost over 100 enslaved workers to escape over the previous 2 years. They supplied Gould with $800 for expenses, promised him an additional $2,000 upon successful capture or confirmed killing of Malachi Briggs, and provided access to the best weapons and equipment available. The journalists were included specifically to document the victory, to create a narrative that would reassure the planter class that order could be restored and that even the most effective resistance could be crushed through sufficient determination and resources. They entered the Big Thicket on July 8, 1851, with elaborate fanfare. The journalists sent daily dispatches for the first week, describing the expedition's progress in confident, almost triumphant terms. The Galveston News published these reports under headlines like Justice Closing In and Fugitive's Reign of Terror Nearing End. The Austin State Gazette ran pieces speculating about what trial and execution would look like once Malachi was captured, debating whether he should be returned to the Henderson estate for private punishment or made an example of through public proceedings. There was a genuine sense among readers that the nightmare was finally approaching resolution. The dispatches described Gould's methodical approach, sophisticated tracking techniques, evidence that they were closing in on their target. They wrote about finding campsites recently abandoned, following trails that seemed to grow fresher, experiencing a sense of imminent confrontation. The tone was confident, even celebratory, describing the expedition as demonstrating what organized determination could accomplish against even the most dangerous fugitive. Then the dispatches stopped. The last report, dated July 14th, described making camp near a creek the expedition believed was close to one of Malachi's known hideouts. The journalist writing it expressed certainty that confrontation would occur within 24 hours, that the campaign was reaching its conclusion. 7 days of silence followed. By July 22nd, concerns had escalated enough that search parties were organized, composed of local men familiar enough with the territory to navigate it without falling victim to the same fate. They found tracks indicating where Gould's expedition had traveled, evidence of camps and movement patterns, but no sign of the men themselves. The search expanded over the following week, eventually involving over 50 individuals combing the forests in organized sweeps. They discovered the expedition on July 29th in a clearing that multiple searchers later described as feeling deliberately chosen, a space in the forest that seemed to exist specifically for what had occurred there. The 15 men were arranged in 3 rows of 5, positioned facing east toward the rising sun, as all of Malachi's victims had been. All were deceased, showing signs of exposure and exhaustion consistent with previous cases. Their bodies bore no wounds from weapons, no evidence of violence in the conventional sense. Medical examination determined they died from the accumulated effects of days without adequate shelter, insufficient food, and the physical toll of sustained psychological stress. But what surrounded them created impact that resonated far beyond East Texas. Their supplies and weapons were displayed around the perimeter of the clearing in careful arrangements, not scattered or stolen but organized as if for exhibition or judgment. Each man's personal effects were laid out separately. Letters from home, photographs, identification papers, contracts authorizing them to pursue and capture fugitives, payment records showing how much they'd earned from previous tracking work. The journalist's notebooks were present, open to specific pages, weighted with stones to prevent wind disturbance. Those notebooks documented the systematic deterioration of the expedition's cohesion over 10 days. Early entries described tracking progress and strategic decisions with confidence and professional competence. But by the 3rd day, the tone shifted dramatically. The journalist wrote about strange incidents that defied explanation. Supplies disappearing, then reappearing in different locations. Sounds in the forest that seemed to come from impossible directions. The persistent sense of being observed and assessed by something they couldn't see or confront. By the 5th day, entries described mounting paranoia and internal conflict. Arguments over navigation despite having compasses and maps. Accusations of cowardice and incompetence flying between men who'd entered the forest as confident professionals. The growing realization that they'd lost all sense of direction despite expertise that should have prevented such basic failure. They wrote about finding carved marks on trees that appeared overnight, about trails that led nowhere, about water sources they could hear but never quite reach, about the gradual understanding that they weren't hunting at all but were being herded. One journalist's final entry, written in increasingly shaky handwriting that suggested physical and psychological deterioration, read, "We entered these forests as masters, as men authorized by law and equipped by wealth to impose order on chaos. But we were never masters here. We were specimens under observation, subjects of an experiment designed to teach us what our prey has always known. Captain Gould keeps insisting we can fight our way free, but there's nothing to fight. There's just knowledge. The knowledge that we are completely understood, completely vulnerable, completely at the mercy of someone who has no intention of showing mercy. I understand now what we've spent years doing to people. I understand the terror we've inflicted. And I understand that this education will end in our deaths, arranged so others might learn what we'll learn too late." The discovery of the expedition, particularly with journalist documentation intact, made the story unavoidable for newspapers across Texas and eventually throughout the South. What had been possible to dismiss as exaggerated rumors or isolated incidents now had documentation, eyewitness testimony from educated white men, and physical evidence that couldn't be ignored or explained away. The Galveston News ran the journalist's final entries verbatim under the headline "Terror in the Thicket, Expedition's Final Hours Revealed." Other newspapers picked up the story, each adding editorial perspectives that range from demands for massive military response to questioning whether the entire system of tracking and capture might be fundamentally flawed. Some editorials demanded that the governor mobilize the Texas Rangers. arguing that state authority was being fundamentally challenged and that failure to respond would encourage resistance across the South, potentially threatening the entire institution of slavery. Others began raising uncomfortable questions about whether violence that generated such sophisticated violent resistance might indicate problems deeper than one fugitive's campaign. A Presbyterian minister in Houston published a sermon titled "The Wages of the Hunter" that argued systems built on the tracking and capture of human beings inevitably generated exactly the kind of resistance Texas was experiencing. The controversy created political paralysis. Governor Bell couldn't mobilize large-scale military operations without legislative approval and funding that weren't forthcoming. The Texas Rangers, already stretched thin dealing with conflicts on the frontier, couldn't spare significant resources for what amounted to recovering private property. Plantation owners throughout East Texas found themselves in an impossible position. They'd lost confidence that fugitives could be recovered, which undermined one of slavery's primary enforcement mechanisms, the certainty that escape would be temporary and punishment severe. But they couldn't acknowledge that confidence was lost because the acknowledgement itself would encourage more escapes. And then, as summer turned to fall in 1851, something changed. The incidents stopped. Not gradually, but suddenly and completely. Tracking teams that entered the forests in September returned safely, finding no interference. Fugitives fleeing through the region reported no signs of the protective presence that had operated for over a year. The sense of danger that had permeated certain territories simply evaporated, leaving behind only questions and the bodies still being discovered, the final victims of a campaign that had apparently reached its conclusion. Authorities didn't know what to make of the sudden cessation. Some theorized Malachi had died from accumulated injuries or illness, that a campaign so sustained and intense couldn't continue indefinitely without eventually destroying the person conducting it. Others suggested he'd fled to Mexico or Indian Territory, recognizing that continued operations would eventually lead to capture regardless of skill or knowledge. A few wondered if he'd been killed quietly by someone who never reported the death, either from fear of retaliation or sympathy with his cause. Speculation filled the absence of concrete information. Wild theories circulated. Some claimed he'd been captured secretly and executed without trial to avoid creating a martyr, that his body had been disposed of where it would never be found. Others insisted he'd received assistance from abolitionists who'd smuggled him north through elaborate underground railroad networks. A few even suggested supernatural explanations, that he'd never been fully human to begin with, that he'd been some kind of avenging spirit that had simply completed its purpose and dissolved back into the forests that had hidden him. But the truth, as it eventually emerged, was both simpler and more profound than speculation suggested. Malachi Briggs had not died. He had not been captured. He had not fled in defeat or desperation. He had simply finished what he'd set out to accomplish. The first hint of truth appeared in the fall of 1851, though it wouldn't be recognized as such for decades. A Quaker settlement in Arkansas reported hosting a traveler who'd passed through in October, a man with extensive scarring on his hands and a quiet, almost meditative demeanor that suggested someone carrying significant weight. He'd stayed 5 days, helping with harvest work and speaking little about his past, though he'd mentioned having recently completed a difficult task that had consumed 2 years of his life. The Quakers, committed to sheltering fugitives as part of their religious conviction, asked no questions that might force uncomfortable truths into open conversation. But one member of the community, a woman named Abigail Morris, kept detailed records of the settlement's visitors and activities. Her entry for October 19, 1851, described the traveler with unusual specificity. A man of perhaps 32 years, she wrote, bearing the physical marks of hard labor and harder living, but possessing an educated manner of speech that suggests background beyond common experience. He worked with exceptional skill in our forge today, repairing tools with efficiency that indicates professional training. When asked how he acquired such capability, he said only that he'd once been trained to create useful objects, and that he'd recently put those skills toward destroying useful objects instead, making weapons unusable, turning tools of bondage into scrap metal. There is about him a quality of completion, as if some great burden has been lifted, or some overwhelming purpose finally fulfilled. He spoke once of someone named Rebecca, saying he hoped she would understand what he'd done in her memory, hoped she would forgive the violence even as he couldn't quite forgive it himself. The diary, discovered in Arkansas Historical Society archives in 1897, contained no mention of the name Malachi Briggs, but the description combined with timing and geographic location suggested a connection that historians would later investigate thoroughly. More definitive answers came in 1879 during Reconstruction's chaotic aftermath, when a package arrived at the Texas State Archives with no return address and minimal explanation. The package had been mailed from Chicago, but postal markings indicated it had traveled a circuitous route through multiple forwarding addresses designed to obscure its origin. Inside was a leather journal, weather-damaged but largely legible, containing daily entries dated from May 1850 through September 1851. The handwriting was careful and educated, the contents methodical and remarkably detailed. It was Malachi Briggs's own account of his campaign, maintained throughout the entire period despite constant risk of discovery and the additional burden such record-keeping represented. The journal's arrival created immediate controversy. Some officials argued it should be destroyed unread, that it represented dangerous propaganda that could inspire similar resistance even years after slavery's legal end. Others insisted it should be preserved as historical evidence, regardless of how uncomfortable that evidence might be. A compromise was eventually reached. The journal would be archived but not publicized, filed in restricted collections accessible only to approved researchers. Despite these restrictions, portions were copied and circulated privately, eventually making their way into publications by formerly enslaved people and their descendants who understood its significance. By the 1890s, substantial excerpts had been published in various forms, making the content accessible despite official suppression efforts. The journal revealed details that investigations had never uncovered. It showed that Malachi had been wounded 4 times during his campaign. Once by rifle fire that had shattered his left collarbone in August 1850, leaving him with limited mobility for nearly 2 months. Once by a knife during close-quarters confrontation with a tracker in November 1850, a wound that had severed muscle in his right forearm and required weeks of careful self-treatment to prevent permanent disability. Once by a fall from a tree while observing a tracking party in March 1851, resulting in cracked ribs and severe bruising that made breathing painful for weeks. And once by snakebite in June 1851, a cottonmouth that had struck his leg while he crossed a creek, requiring immediate field treatment that combined traditional remedies with improvised medical procedures. He treated all 4 injuries himself using the blacksmithing and metalworking knowledge he'd acquired at the Henderson estate, adapting techniques for working with damaged metal to working with damaged flesh, understanding tension and structural integrity in ways that translated surprisingly well to human anatomy. The journal contained detailed descriptions of these treatments. How he'd cleaned and stitched the knife wound using wire and pliers sterilized in fire. How he'd created a makeshift brace for his collarbone using carved wooden strips of leather. How he'd identified and used medicinal plants to prevent infection and manage pain, combinations he'd learned from enslaved healers who'd been forced to develop medical knowledge without access to formal training or supplies. The journal documented the physical toll of sustained operations in wilderness conditions. He described periods of near starvation when tracker activity was too intense to allow safe foraging or hunting. He wrote about the psychological burden of constant vigilance, of sleeping only in brief intervals measured in minutes rather than hours, of calculating every movement to avoid leaving signs that skilled trackers might follow. He described the loneliness of his existence, cut off from all human contact except through violence and intimidation, living like an animal while trying to maintain his humanity. But most significantly, the journal revealed his purpose with a clarity that investigations had never achieved. Malachi Briggs had set himself a specific goal when he'd walked away from the Henderson estate in May 1850. He would operate for exactly 16 months, long enough to fundamentally alter the economics of tracking in East Texas, long enough to make plantation owners question whether the system of capture and return was sustainable. And he would target exactly 48 men, carefully selected based on their reputations and actions, 1 for each month Rebecca had lived after being sold away from him before her death. The journal showed him tracking individual trackers with the same methods they used to track fugitives. He would learn their names, study their techniques, observe them at work, investigate their histories through careful questioning of enslaved people who encountered them. He kept meticulous records not just of their professional work, but of their reputations in communities where they operated, testimony from people they'd captured, accounts from plantation owners who'd employed them. He was looking for specific characteristics. Trackers known for excessive violence during captures. Men who deliberately separated families or showed particular cruelty toward children. Individuals who took obvious pleasure in their work beyond economic motivation. Those who had reputations for inflicting unnecessary punishment during return journeys, using days of travel as opportunities for additional brutality. I cannot hold accountable every person who participates in this evil system, he wrote in an entry dated September 1850. The institution is too vast, too integrated into every aspect of Southern society, too defended by law and custom and economic interest. But I can hold accountable those who enthusiastically embrace its worst aspects, who find in this work not just employment but satisfaction. Each man I selected represents dozens or hundreds of people whose suffering they facilitated or increased. I cannot restore what they took. I cannot undo what they did to Rebecca and to countless others. But I can ensure they understand in their final days what they inflicted, can make them feel what their victims felt, can teach them that actions have consequences even when law provides no justice. The journal entries revealed a mind simultaneously strategic and deeply traumatized. He wrote about Rebecca in passages that mixed grief with anger and determination. He described memories of their brief time together, conversations about impossible futures, plans they'd made knowing they'd never be allowed to fulfill them. He wrote about receiving news of her death and feeling something fundamental break inside him, not his reason or ability to function, but his connection to any possibility that the system might reform itself or allow space for human dignity. Rebecca died believing that compliance might eventually earn mercy, he wrote in May 1850, shortly after beginning his campaign. She believed that working hard, causing no trouble, demonstrating humanity through submission might result in being allowed to remain with the people she loved. She was catastrophically wrong. The system doesn't reward humanity. It consumes it. It takes people's capacity for love and hope and turns those things into weapons for control. And those who enforce that system through tracking and capture, they make escape and resistance necessary. They ensure that families can never exist in peace. They are the mechanism that transforms slavery from abstract evil into concrete daily trauma. But the journal also showed someone who understood the moral complexity of his actions. He didn't romanticize violence or claim unquestionable righteousness. He acknowledged that what he was doing created trauma, inflicted suffering on people who had families and lives beyond their work as trackers, potentially damaged innocent people connected to guilty ones. I do not claim to dispense justice, he wrote in February 1851. Justice would require legitimate authority, fair systems, recognition of everyone's humanity. What I am dispensing is consequence. I am teaching that actions generate responses, that systematic violence eventually produces violence in return, that those who make their living hunting human beings might discover what it means to be hunted. Whether that constitutes justice is a question for people who live in societies where justice is actually possible for everyone. I live in a society where justice is available only to some, where law protects owners and criminalizes the owned, where the violence I commit is called murder while the violence that destroyed Rebecca is called property management. The journal documented his reaching exactly 48 completed targets by September 1851. He tracked each one methodically, marking them in lists that included names, locations, detailed notes about why they'd been selected, descriptions of their reputations and specific acts that had marked them for his attention. The final entry for this list, dated September 17, 1851, simply stated, complete. 48 men for 48 months. The accounting is finished. On September 20, 1851, he wrote what would be his final journal entry, and it revealed both his understanding of what he'd accomplished and what he hadn't. It is finished. 16 months, 48 men, and a region of Texas where the profession of slave catching has become economically and psychologically untenable. I have no illusions about having changed the fundamental structure of this evil system. The institution of slavery is too deeply rooted in economic interest, too thoroughly defended by law and custom, too essential to the wealth of too many powerful people. It will continue until economic forces or moral awakening or violent conflict destroys it, and that destruction may not come for decades if it comes at all. What I have accomplished is limited and temporary, but I have demonstrated several things that needed demonstration. First, that resistance is possible even against overwhelming odds, even when operating alone, even when the entire machinery of state power is mobilized against you. Second, that those who profit from hunting human beings are themselves vulnerable, that their confidence in their safety is built on assumptions that can be challenged and destroyed. Third, that terror is not a condition reserved only for the enslaved, that those who dispense it can also experience it, can also learn what it means to live in constant fear and uncertainty. Most importantly, I have created a record that this resistance occurred. This journal will survive me somehow. It will prove that we are not simply property to be tracked and recovered without consequence. We are human beings capable of judgment, of strategic thinking, of sustained campaigns against the apparatus of our oppression. We remember, we plan, we act, and sometimes we win, even if winning only means teaching painful lessons to those who believe themselves invincible. Tomorrow I walk north toward Arkansas and eventually toward territories where I can no longer be legally hunted. I have made contact through intermediaries with people who help fugitives reach safety, and they have promised passage. I will live whatever life remains to me trying to find some measure of peace, though I doubt peace is truly possible for someone who has done what I have done. I will carry the weight of 48 deaths for the rest of my life. I will wonder if Rebecca would understand and approve, or if she would be horrified by what I became after losing her. I will question whether I crossed lines that should never be crossed regardless of provocation or justification. But I will also know that because of what I did, dozens of people escaped to freedom who would otherwise have been captured and returned to bondage. I will know that the tracking profession in East Texas collapsed, that plantation owners lost confidence in their ability to recover fugitive property, that the economic calculation about pursuing escapees fundamentally changed. I will know that I made slave catchers afraid, that I taught them lessons they taught others, that I demonstrated resistance is possible and sometimes effective even under the most oppressive circumstances. Let this record stand as evidence. Let it prove that resistance occurred. And let it remind those who might read it in some distant future that systems built on violence and dehumanization inevitably generate violent resistance. That is not a moral judgment. It is simply a truth about how power and counterpower function in the world. I dedicated these 16 months to Rebecca's memory, to making her death mean something beyond simple tragedy, to demonstrating that she mattered enough to be remembered through action. I hope I have honored her. I hope she would understand why I chose this path, even if she couldn't approve of all its aspects. Goodbye, Texas. I leave you more troubled than I found you. That was always my intention. After that final entry, Malachi Briggs did exactly what he'd planned. He walked north using routes established by networks that had secretly supported his campaign with supplies and information throughout the 16-month period. Multiple safe houses recorded his passage in coded notation, referring to him as the blacksmith or the man from Texas to avoid using names that might be dangerous if records were discovered. He reached Canada in December 1851, settling in a community of formerly enslaved people near Chatham, Ontario. He lived there under the name Marcus Freeman for the remaining 31 years of his life, working as a blacksmith and occasionally teaching metalworking to younger members of the community. He married again in 1854, a woman named Esther who'd escaped from Kentucky in 1850. They had 4 children together. He shared his story selectively, only with people who'd experienced similar traumas, only in contexts where understanding rather than judgment was possible. Those conversations, documented in a few surviving letters and memoirs from community members, revealed someone who was simultaneously proud of his resistance and burdened by its costs. I would do it again, he told one former fugitive in a conversation recorded in that person's memoir published in 1889. But I would not claim it was simple or righteous or without profound moral complexity. I took lives. I created suffering for people who had families and people who loved them. I traumatized individuals who might have been more than just their worst professional choices. But I also prevented suffering. I made escape possible for people who would otherwise have been captured and brutalized. I altered the calculation that plantation owners made about whether to invest in pursuit. And I demonstrated that we are human beings capable of strategic resistance, not animals to be tracked and recovered without consequence. He died in 1882 from heart failure at approximately 63 years of age. His funeral was attended by over 300 people from the Chatham community and from across Ontario, formerly enslaved people who understood what his Texas campaign had represented, who saw in his 16-month resistance a model for understanding their own experiences and choices. Esther Briggs survived him by 14 years, maintaining the blacksmith shop they'd built together and preserving his papers, including a duplicate journal he'd kept during his time in Canada, recording memories and reflections on the Texas period. When she died in 1896, those papers were donated to an archive in Toronto that specialized in documenting formerly enslaved people's experiences. It was from that archive that researchers in the early 20th century began piecing together the full scope of Malachi Briggs's campaign. Scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois referenced it in passing in their work on slave resistance, though always cautiously, aware that detailed examination of targeted violence against white Americans remained culturally unacceptable even decades after slavery's legal end. The full story began entering mainstream historical consciousness only in the 1960s and 1970s, as civil rights movements created space for more honest examinations of resistance to slavery. Even then it remained controversial. Some historians questioned the accuracy of the journals, whether one man could truly have accomplished everything attributed to him over 16 months while being actively hunted. Others debated the ethics of his actions, whether systematic violence, however targeted and calculated, could ever constitute legitimate resistance. But for many descendants of formerly enslaved people, the story represented something more significant than historical curiosity or ethical debate. It was proof that resistance had occurred on a scale and with a sophistication that had been systematically denied and erased from historical records. It was evidence that enslaved people were capable of strategic thinking, long-term planning, sustained campaigns against their oppression, capabilities that slavery's defenders had insisted they lacked. It was demonstration that the myth of docile acceptance, the comfortable narrative that enslaved people had simply endured their condition without resistance, was alike constructed to make slavery's history more palatable to its beneficiaries' descendants. The final accounting of Malachi's campaign, compiled from multiple historical sources, showed 48 confirmed deaths of slave catchers between May 1850 and September 1851, with an additional 23 men who survived encounters but never worked in that profession again. The economic impact on the tracking industry in East Texas was severe enough that insurance companies stopped covering operations entirely, rewards increased to levels most planters couldn't afford, and the entire system of pursuit and recapture became untenable in that specific region for over 2 years. Several plantations in the affected area experienced significant increases in successful escapes during 1850 through 1852, fugitives who made it to Mexico, to Indian Territory, to Arkansas, and eventually to Canada, specifically because the usual mechanisms of recapture had been disrupted. While exact numbers are impossible to establish with certainty, estimates based on plantation records and Underground Railroad documentation suggest that between 90 and 140 people successfully escaped from plantations in East Texas during the period when Malachi's campaign had made tracking too dangerous and expensive to be routinely employed. That number, the people who gained freedom because professional trackers were afraid to operate, represents perhaps the most concrete measure of his campaign's impact. Those were lives fundamentally changed, families preserved or reunited, futures made possible that the system would have prevented. Those were children who grew up free instead of enslaved, who received education instead of forced labor, who built lives they chose instead of lives dictated by ownership. The ripple effects of those 90 to 140 escapes extended through generations, affecting hundreds or thousands of descendants who existed because someone made it to freedom rather than being captured and returned to bondage. The sites where incidents occurred are now largely unmarked and forgotten. The clearing where Harrison Gould's expedition was discovered remained avoided by local residents for decades, not from superstition exactly, but from lingering awareness that some locations bear permanent marks of what occurred there. The trees in that clearing bore scars from rope and positioning that remained visible until the early 1900s, when the entire forest was cleared for lumber operations. Today almost nothing remains to mark what happened in those Texas forests between 1850 and 1851. County records that once documented the incidents were systematically removed or destroyed, likely during the 1870s and 1880s as part of broader efforts to reshape historical narratives about slavery and resistance. The sites where bodies were discovered are now shopping centers, residential subdivisions, and agricultural land developed during Texas's 20th century growth. Historical markers dot the landscape discussing cotton agriculture, the Texas Revolution, and regional development, but none mention Malachi Briggs or the 16-month campaign that challenged one of slavery's most brutal enforcement mechanisms. That absence is not accidental. It represents deliberate choices about which histories get preserved in public space, and which get relegated to archives and academic discussions, which stories get told to school children, and which get buried in restricted collections. But the absence of markers doesn't mean the absence of history or memory. The story survived through journals, letters, oral traditions passed down through communities that understood its significance. It survived because it represented something the official narratives wanted to erase, evidence that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated resistance, that they could and did fight back against their oppression in ways that were strategic, sustained, and sometimes devastatingly effective. Malachi Briggs never claimed to be a hero, and his journal makes clear he understood the moral complexity of his actions, the violence he'd employed, the trauma he'd inflicted even on people who might have been more than their worst professional choices. But he also understood something the system refused to acknowledge: that when legal justice is impossible, when institutional violence is constant and inescapable, when human beings are treated as property to be tracked and recovered like stray animals, resistance becomes not just justified but necessary for maintaining any sense of human agency and dignity. The 48 men who died in those forests weren't innocent victims of random violence. They were participants in a system that commodified human beings, that separated families for profit, that enforced through violence and terror one of history's most brutal institutions. Their deaths weren't justice, not in any complete or satisfying sense. But they were consequence. They were recognition that actions have responses, that systems of violence eventually generate violent resistance, and that those who hunt other human beings might discover what it means to be hunted. Whether that constitutes moral victory, tragic necessity, or simply brutal chapter in brutal history remains a question each person must answer based on their own ethical framework and relationship to histories of violence and resistance. What cannot be questioned is that it happened. That one man, motivated by grief and determination, sustained a 16-month campaign against professional slave catchers that fundamentally altered the economics and psychology of that profession in a specific region. That his actions created space for others to escape. That he survived and lived another 31 years in freedom. And that his story, despite systematic efforts to erase it, survived to challenge our understanding of resistance, justice, and human capacity for strategic action even under conditions of absolute oppression. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions that have no easy answers. Questions about justice when legal systems protect oppressors and criminalize the oppressed. Questions about violence in response to violence, about whether there are lines that should never be crossed regardless of provocation, or whether those lines dissolve under certain extremes of injustice. Questions about how we evaluate historical figures who did terrible things for understandable reasons, who inflicted trauma while fighting systems designed to inflict worse trauma on millions. Malachi Briggs's campaign wasn't simple heroism or simple brutality. It was something more complex, more troubling, and more significant than either category allows. It was one man's attempt to impose consequences on a system that recognized no consequences for the violence it inflicted daily on enslaved people. It was resistance that succeeded in limited ways while failing to change the fundamental structures of oppression. It was violence that saved some lives while taking others, that created space for freedom while creating trauma that lasted generations. What do you think? Were Malachi's actions justified responses to impossible circumstances, or did they cross ethical lines that should never be crossed regardless of provocation? How do we evaluate resistance when it employs methods as brutal as the system it opposes? Could you survive what those trackers faced in the forests, and does understanding their experience change how you think about the work they did? These aren't simple questions, and they don't have simple answers, but they are questions we need to ask if we're going to honestly examine our history rather than sanitizing it into comfortable narratives. If you found this story as powerful and disturbing as we did, please subscribe to The Sealed Room and hit that notification bell. These are the kinds of stories textbooks avoid, the chapters of our past that remain controversial even now, more than a century and a half after they occurred. We're committed to exploring these buried histories honestly, without simplification or sanitization, acknowledging complexity while refusing to look away from difficult truths. Share this video with someone who appreciates honest examinations of American history, who understands that the past is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be, who can handle stories that don't provide easy moral clarity. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We genuinely want to hear different perspectives on this complex piece of hidden history. How do you think about Malachi Briggs? About Rebecca? About the trackers who died and the people who escaped because of what he did? These are the stories that need to be remembered, discussed, and grappled with honestly. Not to celebrate violence, but to understand the full scope of human experience under systems of oppression, to recognize the impossible choices people faced, to acknowledge that resistance took many forms, some of which remain morally complicated even as we recognize their historical significance. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next investigation into America's buried past.